Nathan's lying. Those two words left my father's mouth like they meant nothing. Like he was commenting on the weather. Forks froze mid-air. My cousin Bryce nearly knocked over his glass. Aunt Marlene pressed a hand to her chest. My sister Vanessa went completely still at the far end of the table, her eyes wide and locked on mine. The chatter died instantly, swallowed by a silence so thick I could hear the candles flickering. Every face turned toward me. Some carried confusion. Some carried doubt. A few wore that particular look people get when they expect something ugly to unfold. I am Nathan Caldwell. I am 41 years old. I run a consulting firm and manage investments. For 3 years, I had been the one caring for my mother through her illness, sitting beside her in hospital rooms while others were busy with their own lives. I had read her documents. I had verified them. I had trusted them. My mother, Dorothy Caldwell, had passed 8 weeks before that dinner. She had left me the land. She had done so clearly, legally, and in writing. And my father had just called me a liar in front of everyone who shared our blood. I gripped the edge of the dining table. Not because I was losing balance, but because I needed something solid while the room shifted around me. My brother-in-law Patrick cleared his throat and looked down at his plate. My cousin Bryce shifted in his seat. My uncle kept his eyes on his food, pretending he hadn't heard. But he had. Everyone had. My father sat at the head of the table, chin slightly raised, wearing the expression of a man who believed he had just made a decisive point. He had been building to this moment. I could see that now. A family dinner, surrounded by relatives whose opinions he had spent decades carefully shaping. This was not an outburst. This was a performance. You've all seen how Nathan operates, he added, leaning back. Always finding angles. The blood rose in my face. Every instinct told me to respond immediately, to lay out every document, every fact. But I stopped myself, because I had already prepared for this. Not this exact dinner, but something like it. I had watched a storm forming for months, dark and slow and inevitable. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. I smiled, just barely, not because I was happy, because I already knew how this would end. My father's campaign against me had not started that evening. It had started years before, quietly, the way rot begins at the root of a tree long before anyone notices it on the surface. 5 years ago, he had accidentally misplaced deed transfer documents my mother asked him to sign, the ones that would formally move a parcel of land into my name. He apologized charmingly, said he must have set them somewhere. My mother reprinted the papers. He delayed again, and again. Then came the comments, dropped casually into family conversations. Nathan means well, but has always been a bit loose with money. Oh, Dorothy, you know how he is. He gets distracted. Each remark landed gently, like seeds pressed into soil. At a cousin's wedding 4 years earlier, he told 3 relatives I had mishandled a family property investment. He said it quietly, apologetically, as though he hated saying it. It wasn't true, but by the time I heard about it, the story had already traveled the room. At the time, I brushed each incident aside. I told myself he was old-fashioned and difficult. But sitting at that dinner table, watching him recline with satisfaction, I finally saw the full picture. This had never been careless. Every single move had been deliberate. What my father did not know was that I had spent the past 4 months preparing. It had started with a feeling, a quiet, persistent sense that things were not adding up. Documents that should have been easy to locate kept disappearing. Phone calls about the estate went unreturned. A neighbor mentioned someone had been asking questions about the land my mother left me. Questions that had nothing to do with condolences. I said nothing at the time. I made a note in a small book I kept in my desk drawer and kept watching. Then I called Philip Okafor. Philip was not a family friend. He was not someone my father had ever met. He was a property and estate lawyer with 22 years of experience, recommended by a colleague who had used him in a complicated inheritance dispute. I met Philip at his downtown office on a Tuesday, 3 months before that dinner. I brought everything. The original will, correspondence from my mother's solicitor, property records, tax documents, and a timeline I had built myself. Philip read quietly for 40 minutes without speaking. When he finally looked up, he said, "Nathan, this is solid. But we need to move now. before anything else shifts. I already had notarized copies made, stored in 2 separate locations. I did not go home and fall apart after that dinner. I drove steadily, brewed coffee, and sat at my kitchen table for a long while. There was real grief in it. My mother had been gone only 8 weeks. The land was not just property. It was the plot behind her childhood home. She had told me once, during one of our evening walks there, that she wanted it to stay in hands that would care for it. She had chosen mine. That meant something I could not fully put into words. But grief and clarity can exist at the same time. That night, I felt both. My father had miscalculated. He had watched me grieve and assumed grief had made me weak. He had watched me stay quiet during the early estate meetings and assumed quietness was confusion. He had spent years convincing relatives I was careless and impulsive, and now he believed his own story. He had no idea I had been documenting everything. That Philip had copies stored independently. That Aunt Marlene had her own letters. He had no idea that calm, in my case, was not surrender. It was strategy. I finished my coffee. I opened my notebook. I wrote 3 words at the top of a fresh page. I am ready. Philip arrived at my father's house on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the dinner. I did not go with him. That had been Philip's suggestion, and I agreed. My presence would have given my father someone to react against. Sending Philip alone, formally, professionally, sent a different message entirely. It said, "This is no longer a family argument. This is a legal matter." Philip carried a sealed envelope containing notarized copies of my mother's will, the property deed assigned to me, a certified letter from her original solicitor confirming intent, and a summary of the family trust structure she had established in her final year. Every page bore official stamps. Every signature had been witnessed and verified. My father opened the door and smiled at first. He assumed Philip was there on some minor errand, easily dismissed. Philip handed him the envelope and waited. My father read the first page, then the second. His expression changed somewhere in the middle of the third. By the time he reached the solicitor's letter, the smile was completely gone. He tried to speak. Philip said he opened his mouth twice and closed it both times, like a man searching for an argument and finding nothing to hold. The documents were clay. The seals were real. My father called me that same evening. I let the first call ring. I genuinely needed a moment before I spoke to him. The second call came 4 minutes later, and I picked up. "Philip can't be right," he said. His voice carried the strain of a man trying to sound authoritative while standing on nothing solid. "Nathan, you're twisting your mother's wishes." I said nothing immediately. I let the silence work. "The will I have is the correct one," he continued. "Your mother and I discussed this. She wanted the estate handled properly." "Dad," I said quietly. Philip explained everything in full. "The documents are notarized. The solicitor's letter is certified. If you have questions, Philip is available to walk you through them again." "This is a family matter," he said, his voice rising slightly. "It started as one," I replied. "You changed that at dinner when you called me a liar in front of everyone." He went quiet. I told him I held no anger toward him. That was true. What I felt was something steadier and harder than anger, a settled certainty that the facts would hold, that preparation always outlasts improvisation, and that a man who mistakes his son's silence for weakness tends to make very costly errors. My mother had known, in those final months, that something was not right. She never said it plainly. That was not her way. But there were signs I had catalogued carefully. A phone call I overheard in the hospital corridor, where she told someone she was making sure things were protected. A quiet conversation she had with her original solicitor about what happened to property if someone contested the documents. And then there were the recordings. 3 months before she passed, during a visit while she was still lucid and strong, she had told me she was worried. She did not name anyone. She only said she feared someone might try to reinterpret her wishes after she was gone. She asked me to keep our conversations private. I used my phone to record those visits, with her knowledge. She had nodded when I explained what I was doing. She said, "Good. That's smart, Nathan." Those recordings were now in Philip's possession, stored securely alongside the rest of the documentation. I had not played them for anyone yet. I was waiting for the right moment. My father had no idea they existed. He had no idea my mother had anticipated this. He believed he was the one who understood her best. He had never been more wrong. The whispers had already started within a week of Philip's visit. My cousin Bryce called me on a Sunday afternoon, sounding careful and uncertain. My father had reached out to him. He had told Bryce I was acting irrationally about the estate and that the family needed to present a united front. Bryce said he had listened politely but had not committed to anything. 2 days later, my sister Vanessa texted me. "Dad says you're creating a problem. Is everything okay?" I called her immediately and we talked for an hour. I told her everything. The documents, the timeline, Philip's assessment, Aunt Marlene's letters. I did not ask her to choose sides. I only asked her to look at the facts before forming an opinion. She was quiet for a long time. "I knew something was off," she said finally. "When Mum was sick, he kept trying to get into her study when she was sleeping. Said he was looking for insurance papers." I wrote that down. My father had spent years building a carefully managed image, the steady patriarch, the responsible one who held the family together. That image had real weight. But images built on control tend to crack when the person maintaining them begins to panic. He was beginning to panic. Aunt Marlene came to my apartment on a Wednesday evening carrying a small wooden box. She had been my mother's closest friend since they were teenagers. They had grown up on the same street, attended the same church, raised their children in neighboring towns. During my mother's illness, Aunt Marlene had visited every week without fail, sitting by the bed, reading aloud, keeping gentle company. She set the box on my kitchen table and opened it carefully. Inside were 12 letters, handwritten on cream-colored paper in my mother's familiar slanted script. Some were dated from her final year. 2 were from over a decade ago. "She gave me these to keep," Aunt Marlene said. "She told me if anyone ever questioned her wishes about the land, I should bring these forward." I read the letters slowly. Each one was specific and personal. In one, my mother wrote that she had chosen me to hold the land because she trusted my judgment and knew I would not carve it apart. In another, she wrote of pressure being placed on her to change certain decisions and that she wanted her true intentions clearly known. She had named my father in 2 of the letters, not with hatred, but plainly. Aunt Marlene's eyes were wet while I read. It was during a routine call with Philip, in the 5th week after the dinner, that something unexpected surfaced. Philip had been reviewing my father's financial history in relation to the estate, standard procedure when preparing for potential legal challenges. During that review, a discrepancy appeared in a transaction from 2 years prior. A payment from one of the family trust accounts, modest in amount but irregular in structure, had been processed in a way that did not align with the trust's stated terms. Philip brought it to me carefully. He did not say fraud. He said requires clarification. He sent my father a formal letter the following day, requesting documentation and a written explanation of the payment's purpose and authorization. I found out about my father's reaction through Vanessa, who happened to be visiting when the letter arrived. She said he read it standing in the kitchen doorway. For a full minute afterward, he did not move. He placed the letter on the counter very slowly, as though setting down something fragile. Then he called someone. She could not hear who. I did not celebrate. I wrote it down and added it to the file in my desk drawer. If there was nothing irregular about the transaction, the documentation would confirm that. My father's calls to my siblings became more frequent and more urgent as the weeks moved forward. He called Vanessa on a Monday and spoke to her for over an hour. She told me afterward that he had tried 3 separate approaches. First sympathy, then mild guilt, then a version of logic that reframed everything as a misunderstanding caused by my tendency to overcomplicate things. She had listened to all 3. She called me that same evening. "Is Skade?" she said. Not a question. He called Patrick as well, who said directly and with characteristic brevity that he did not involve himself in family legal matters and ended the call after 3 minutes. I did not call anyone that week. I sent each family member a short, factual email attaching the latest certified documents Philip had prepared. No pressure, no framing, just the facts, cleanly presented, with Philip's contact information at the bottom. 3 relatives responded within 2 days. All said variations of the same thing. That the documents were clear, that they had no remaining questions, and that they were sorry it had come to this. My father was running out of ears willing to bend his way. The facts had done what I had always believed they would do, given enough time and honest presentation. Philip arrived at Aunt Marlene's house on a Sunday afternoon. The gathering had been arranged at her home deliberately. It was neutral ground, not my space, not my father's. 14 family members attended. My father sat at one end of the room. I sat near the window. Philip stood at the front and spoke for 25 minutes without interruption. He presented the notarized will first, projecting a scanned copy on screen and walking through each relevant clause slowly and without legal jargon. Then the property deed. Then the certified solicitor's letter and the 2 independent legal assessments. He laid out the full timeline, the original signing, the delayed transfers, the missing documents, the transactions requiring clarification. Then he read from 2 of Aunt Marlene's letters, with her permission, and from the letter my mother had addressed to Philip directly, the one Theo had carefully preserved. When he finished, the room was completely silent. My father did not speak for almost 2 full minutes. When he finally opened his mouth, Philip asked him gently but precisely whether he had documentation to counter any specific point. My father looked at the papers in front of him. His hands rested flat on the table. He had nothing. Every claim had been answered. The final family gathering was held 3 weeks later. By this point, the shape of things was clear to everyone present. But clarity and acknowledgement are not the same thing, and I believe the complete, public accounting mattered, not for revenge, but for the record. My mother's name deserved to be cleared of confusion. Her wishes deserved to be stated plainly in front of everyone who had heard them questioned. I presented the full body of evidence myself that evening, calmly and in order. The will, the deed, Aunt Marlene's letters, Theo's letters, the independent legal assessments, the certified financial records, the recording my mother had knowingly participated in, where she named me by choice and stated her reasoning clearly. My father attempted to speak twice. The first time, he suggested the recording was taken out of context. Philip addressed that directly, citing the date, location, and my mother's confirmed mental capacity at the time of recording. The second time, my father said the family should focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on the past. 3 different relatives, including my uncle who had initially doubted me, said politely but firmly that moving forward required acknowledging what had happened first. He sat back down. There was no shouting, no dramatics. It was Philip who brought the final discovery to my attention, with the careful and measured tone of a man who had seen this before. During his continued review of the estate paperwork, he had identified 2 property title transfers that had been initiated quietly and without my knowledge or consent. Both were recent, processed within the 4 months following my mother's passing. Both involved parcels that formed part of the land she had left me. Both carried my father's signature as initiating party. Philip filed an immediate legal challenge on both transfers. He also filed a formal notice with the property registry, flagging the transactions for review and citing the contested will and ongoing legal proceedings. He sent my father formal notice of the challenge that same day. I was not present when my father received it, but Vanessa happened to be visiting that afternoon and told me what she had seen. He read the notice standing in the kitchen doorway, much as he had read Philip's earlier letter. This time, though, he did not go still. He sat down heavily in the nearest chair. He placed the paper on the table. He stared at the window for a long time without speaking. He looked like a man who finally understood something. Vanessa said quietly. The family met for the final time on a Thursday evening at Aunt Marlene's house. It was smaller than the previous gatherings. Only the people directly involved, who had been present throughout, who held pieces of this story in their hands. My father was there. He arrived alone. He had always, in the past, brought someone with him, an ally, a sympathetic presence, someone to validate his position simply by sitting nearby. That evening, he walked in alone and took the chair that had been left near the window. Philip spoke first, summarizing the legal conclusion briefly. The will was valid and binding, the property deed confirmed in my name, the unauthorized title transfers reversed and formally noted on record. The trust account transaction remained under review. Then the family spoke. Not everyone had words. Some sat in silence, which carried its own weight. But one by one, The relatives who had doubted me, some openly, some quietly, acknowledged what the evidence had shown. My uncle spoke directly. Bryce said he was sorry he had not asked more questions earlier. Even Sandra, who had been carefully neutral throughout, said she now understood why I had been so thorough. My father sat through all of it without arguing. He did not perform. When it was my turn to speak, I stewed slowly. I had thought about this moment for weeks. I had drafted words in my notebook that I ultimately set aside. Too sharp, too constructed. What I said that evening came plainly. I told the family I held no anger toward my father. That was true, as complicated as it sounds. Anger requires surprise, and I had not been surprised. I had been watchful and patient. What I felt instead was a deep tiredness, the kind that comes from spending years defending something that should never have needed defending. I told them about my mother, about evenings at the hospital when she had been frightened and clear-eyed at the same time, about our conversations regarding the land, what it meant to her, what she hoped it would stay, why she had chosen to leave it in my care. She had not made that choice carelessly. She had made it after watching her family for a lifetime. I said I intended to honor that choice in full. Then I thanked Philip, Aunt Marlene, Theo, and Vanessa, and every person who had been willing to look at the truth when it was placed before them. I sat back down. The room was quiet. My father looked at the table. 3 months later, the estate was settled. The land was formally and permanently in my name. The trust structures my mother had established were secured under independent oversight. The transaction discrepancy had been reviewed and resolved in a way I chose to handle privately. There were matters I decided to let rest, not because they didn't matter, but because there is a difference between justice and destruction, and I had no interest in destroying anyone. I hired a surveyor and spent a morning walking the property with him. It was late autumn. The grass was long. The old oak at the eastern boundary had dropped most of its leaves. The surveyor pointed out markers and measurements, but I was mostly just walking, taking in the shape of the land, watching the light move across it in the late morning. My mother had loved this place. She had walked it herself, in all seasons. I understood now, more completely than ever, why she had wanted it protected. I thought about the dinner where my father had called me a liar, the silence that followed, the faces around that table, uncertain and waiting, the way I had gripped the edge of the wood and decided, in that moment, to stay calm. The land was mine. The truth was known.